professor of journalism at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I am a long, long way from home, and today I'm sort of hitting the wall where the jet lag and the conference are starting to catch up to me. So somebody promised me that if I start to doze off, you'll just kind of elbow me. It's all right. I won't take offense. I want to talk to you about drones, but every time I do this, I sort of have to start with some definitions. And when I talk about drones, I'm not talking about the things that the military, particularly the United States military, has, and I'm not talking about the stuff that you see in movies. Let's just start right now. We've all seen too many of them. So I'm, just for sake of demonstration, I am going to show you a flying deathmobile that I give to my students, and hopefully nobody runs in terror because it's this. I don't get randomly searched at airports when I bring this one. When I bring the bigger ones, the ones that we actually use, I usually get a tour of airport security offices. Hands down going away, the most terrifying one was in Dubai, because I had to put my gear through an x-ray machine in order to leave the airport. And as soon as I did that, a bunch of very uniformed gentlemen started speaking very excited Arabic. And then they told me that I had to put it over here and open it immediately. And then they told me I had to put it over here and open it. And then they took me into a back room. But they didn't let the people who were with me who spoke English and Arabic go with me. So now I'm alone with a bunch of people who speak Arabic and I don't speak Arabic, and they're very excitedly talking, and now I'm in a back room all by myself, and I am starting to pee my pants. They took me into a room that was a supervisor's office very clearly, because he was sitting on a couch watching TV. They began to explain what was going on. He looked over. This is literally what happened. And they said, "Welcome to Dubai," and they let me go. And I walked out of there going, what just happened? And I try not to travel with them now, but get ready to duck. Anybody scared of the big bad drone now? Do we have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about? Now obviously you can't mount a camera on this. You can't violate privacy or anything like that. These I give to my students to teach them how to fly because they crash a lot. The students, not the drone. The students, not the drone. The students crash these a lot. These are very, very tough. They cost about $40, and they're a heck of a lot of fun, particularly if you have small pets. They're terrifying. So this is closer to what I'm talking about than military drones. If you think about a military drone is larger than most manned aircraft. They cost anywhere from $4 to $130 million. They are guided by satellites, and they're not anything close to what we're talking about. These are much closer to what we're talking about. So when I talk about drone journalism, I start like this. I am not smart enough to do complicated. That's just the very basis that I have. So let's not overthink this. Drone journalism is just the use of unmanned vehicles to gather photos, video, or data for journalistic purposes. It's a flying camera. That's it. We don't need to overcomplicate things. We don't need to go into anything more than that. It's just a flying camera. So when I talk about this, I have to be very real with people. And the first thing I say is, this is very cool. Believe me, every day I go to the office and I get to fly one of these things, my inner teenage boy is like, this is great. This is awesome. I can't believe somebody is paying me money to do this. But, and I tell my students this all the time, you have to get over that immediately. Because the next thing you realize is, this can be very dangerous. People can get hurt. People can be psychologically damaged. People's privacy can be violated. From the very beginning, we have said, when it comes to the Drone Journalism Lab, one of the answers must always be, this is a terrible idea and we should stop. That always has to be an answer to whatever question it is. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background before I talk about what are the possibilities. What could we do? The fact of the matter is, this gets more and more difficult every day around the world. Every day, a new country is adding aviation regulations to the books that weren't there before. Countries that have them are making them more difficult. Aviation regulators everywhere are coming to grips with these devices. And there is a shocking amount of history involved that I'll get into, that once you understand it, a lot of decisions start to make sense. If you view these as a fundamentally new device, they make no sense at all. If you view this as a technological innovation, this makes no sense at all. If you view this as an aircraft and you follow the history of aviation regulation, it makes total sense. So I'm going to try to do that in a minute. These devices, more than anything, are a context machine. They seem to be purpose-built to help people understand the scale of an event, how big something is, how far something goes, what it looks like from a perspective. And that is the most powerful thing that they can provide. Regardless of the format of the data that you're pulling off, be it a photo, video, mapping, 3D rendering, all kinds of those, it's all about perspective. That's what these are good at providing. The number one argument for drone journalism is the economic one. And I can break it down pretty simply like this. To rent a manned helicopter, to put a journalist in a manned helicopter with a camera to get a photo, costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,500 to $1,800 an hour. An hour. A really good drone that is easy to fly, that can get 4K video and really good still photos, about $1,500. Period. That's it. All of your costs are up front. You can get a more professional grade model starting at about $3,000. After that, I can pretty much find you a drone that fits your budget. I don't want to sound like a car salesman, but that's sort of what it is. Whatever you want to spend, somebody out there will gladly take your money and provide you something. There's a German company called Schiebel that sells a miniaturized helicopter. It's gas-powered. You have to be a rotor wing aircraft pilot in order to fly it, and it flies obscenely fast. But they use it to follow rally races. So cars that are whizzing by at race speeds, they're just following them, and that camera is dead still. The cars are bouncing on these roads and flying all around, and the camera looks like it's on a rail. And it's amazing. So that's the economic argument. Renting manned aircraft, very expensive. Drones are cheap, and your second flight is essentially free. Your only costs after that pretty much are insurance and electrical power to power the battery back up. That's it. That economic argument is winning over industries all over the place, not just journalism. Pretty much any industry that has physical infrastructure to deal with is looking at drones as a solution to monitoring that infrastructure. And it goes from agriculture to golf courses. Golf course managers want to use them to help water the fairways. I have had farmers ask me during calving season, when cattle are giving birth, they have to get up every few hours in the night and go check on their herd, and they've asked me, can I just lay in bed and fly a drone over them? I'm like, well, yeah, actually, technologically it's possible. Regulations, not so much. Let's get into that. As journalists, we are not accustomed to dealing in highly regulated industries. As much as we talk about press freedom and we talk about press restrictions and we talk about the struggles that we have, journalism is not a highly regulated industry, not like aviation. This is an area of practice that we are not acclimated to at all. It's complicated, it's arduous, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and anything you want to do is going to take a lot longer than you think it is going to take. Part of the reason why it's a highly regulated business is that when you put rapidly spinning blades in proximity to people, that creates a dangerous situation. We have to be careful. We do not often deal in tools that can hurt people, that can do permanent physical damage to a person, even accidentally. So these are processes and things that we are having to deal with that we have not had to deal with before. And globally, this is everywhere. We haven't yet figured out all of the ways that this technology is going to impact our privacy, our personal property rights, our psychology. And as more of them come about, new problems are presented that we have to think through. I have said all along that I believe that the slow nature of the civil aviation authorities around the world is actually a gift to journalism, because it gives us more time to think about what we're going to do before we do it. More often in journalism, we are handed a technology and say, figure it out. Stories due in an hour, figure it out. And that's what we have to do. This time, we have much more time. We have much more ability to think through what we're going to do. Now, when we're talking about property and privacy and ethics and things like that, this is where you have to understand the history. And the history can be summed up like this. It's all the French's fault. Actually, if you really, really, really wanted to lay blame here, the Romans actually sort of carry a lot of the weight here. Because it was Roman law that decided that he who owns the ground owns the skies to the heavens above. So if you owned a piece of property, that meant you controlled the skies to the ends of the universe above you. Now that was convenient because there was nobody up there. And it wasn't until a very, very brave Parisian in 1783 pumped a bunch of hot air into a sack and went for a ride in the skies. And while the people of Paris were amazed, and they stood there with their mouths open, lawyers across Europe went, hold on, I believe that person's trespassing right now, because we own to the skies and the heavens above. Uh-oh, or do we own the skies? And it began a centuries-old debate about ownership of the skies. Is the sky a public good? Or is it owned by somebody? Can you own the sky? Can you own a piece of it? Can you control it? And the honest-to-God answer is, we still don't really know. There hasn't been a definitive court case anywhere that said, absolutely, you own the sky, or absolutely you do not own the sky. There have been attempts at it and sort of glancing blows at it. One of the most substantial rulings happened in 1946 in the United States. It was a Supreme Court case that was over chickens. In the war, the United States Army Air Corps started buying up runways all over the United States. One of them they bought in North Carolina, and they expanded it all the way to the edge of the Cosby's chicken farm. And then they began landing bombers on it day and night. The noise, if you've ever been around a World War II era bomber, you know that they are not quiet. They are a very, very loud aircraft. Well, they are landing these things no more than 83 feet above these people's house, day and night. The chickens were so thoroughly terrified, they began smashing themselves against the walls to get away and killed themselves. The ones that didn't go crazy enough to kill themselves no longer produced eggs, stopped eating, and became so thin that they were worthless and died. The Cosbys went bankrupt. They tried to sell the farm. The farm was more or less worthless at that point, and they sued the United States federal government for this. What the Supreme Court decided was a really, really twisted set of logic that legal scholars to this day say it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but we've never really gone back and fixed it. What they said was, you can't trespass in the air, but if you create such a nuisance in the air that it deprives people the use of their property on the ground, then that's tantamount to trespassing, and you're taking their property away from them. And the ruling said, you control the immediate reaches of your environment. But then they didn't say what that was. And since there was only one number in it, a certain number of lawyers and judges have said, you control to 83 feet, because that's the lowest point at which the bombers were landing over their house. There's another passage that says you should be able to plant a tree. So a second group of lawyers said, well, the tallest tree you can plant is about 200 feet. So you control the 200 feet. The problem with this is there's been no definitive answer. So now that in the hallway you can watch Amazon's delivery drone try to land products in your yard, there is a substantial question about whether or not they can legally do that, whether they have any right to fly over your neighbor's property to get to yours and drop it off in your yard. This is true all over the world. Nobody really has a good answer to these questions. In the United States, with the First Amendment, our press freedoms, it wasn't until 80 years after the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk and manned flight really started to become a thing, that we got a Supreme Court decision. We got a First Amendment decision about photographs from the air. People had been taking pictures from the sky, and it was never really explicitly said, you have a First Amendment right to do this. And it actually was, if it had been anyone other than the government, it would have been fantastic investigative journalism. The Environmental Protection Agency went to a chemical plant in 1983, and they said, we know you are dumping chemicals illegally on this property. Let us on so we can document this and fine you. And the Dow Chemical Company said, go away. You may not come onto the property. You have no right. So the very enterprising administrator, the Environmental Protection Administrator, went to the nearest airport, found a pilot, rented an airplane, and flew right over the property and took pictures of it from the air. Dow Chemical sued. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that at the minimum altitude for manned aircraft, 500 feet, the sky is a public street. If you can see it from 500 feet, you can see it from the ground. It makes no difference. You have a First Amendment right to take a picture from a public place, but it has to be at 500 feet. Well, these devices in most countries are capped at an altitude, and that altitude is below manned aviation level. So there is a substantial question of, is that lower level akin to a public street? Can you take photos there? We don't know. Many states in the United States are starting to regulate this. Many countries are starting to regulate this. We're starting to have these very same discussions about private property and whether or not you have rights above your property, whether you have air rights, all over the world, all over again. It's like it's 1783 all over again. As I said before, more and more countries every day are adding UAS regulations, and there is no standard. Nobody has got one law that everyone says, that's the one we're going to copy. I had a conversation with a senior administrator in the Civil Aviation Authority of the UK, and what he said to me was, civil aviation authorities are like teenagers. They are fad conscious. They follow each other. Everybody copies everybody. And unfortunately, the FAA in the United States is one that everybody copies pretty substantially. We are waiting on rules from the FAA. They're coming very soon, and I have a very bad feeling that they're going to set worldwide standards, because some countries have done a much better job at this than the United States has by far. Most of Europe is better on this than the United States by far. Many places in Latin America, much better than this than the United States by a long way. Australia has been out in the lead of the world for better than a decade now. But aviation regulations are one thing. Few countries, if any to my knowledge, have actually specifically addressed drones and their privacy regulations. And there's a debate whether or not that's a good idea or not. Generally, we don't want laws that are technology specific. We want them to be agnostic of the technology. We want them to just say, we don't want this behavior, and it doesn't matter how you do it, just don't do that. Don't violate privacy. Doesn't matter how, just don't do it. No country on Earth has defined airspace for individual property owners, to my knowledge. I have not heard of anyone, and I've been looking. So we have no global standard for safety regulation. We have no good guidelines on privacy, and we have no real consensus about private property. What could go wrong? What could possibly happen? Well, I'll tell you what can go wrong. I started the Drone Journalism Lab in November 2011, and our first story was about drought on a river in Nebraska in a very, very rural place. Now, if you have ever been to the great state of Nebraska, you realize that me saying very, very in front of rural is completely redundant. It's a very small state. It is largely agricultural. You can drive, in some parts of the state, you can literally drive 20, 30, 40 minutes and not see another human being. There are entire counties, smaller subdivisions of the state, that have fewer people in it than this hotel right now. So it's sparse. We went out and went to very rural places. We filmed the river in the midst of a historically bad drought. We put the story online. We did a story about how we did the story, and about 20 to 30 news organizations from around the world wrote stories about us doing this story. One of them was the Kansas City Star, a city about 2.5 hours away from Lincoln. There is a substantial FAA office in the Kansas City metro area. I do believe the Kansas City Star ended up on the break room table at the FAA because 8 months after we did that story, we received a letter, a legal cease and desist order from the FAA saying, stop flying now. Now, if you have never received a legal threat from a federal regulatory agency, I highly recommend it. It's thrilling. After you are done peeing in your pants, after you are done worrying about what the weather is like in most federal detention facilities at that time, you begin to breathe again. And then you read it again, and then you call the person who sent you the letter, which is what we did. And we said, why are we getting this letter? And they said, oh, you just got it because you're a state university. And so we think you're the government. So you have to follow the government rules. And that was news to us because we looked at the government rules and it said absolutely nothing about education. It said aeronautics research, but we weren't building a drone. We were just flying one. And they had commercial rules, which at that time you couldn't fly commercially, period, at all. That changed in the next year. So we thought, well, I guess we're just hobbyists. We're just people flying, because we're not making money, so we're not commercial. We're not the government, because it never mentioned education in there. We'll just be hobbyists. FAA said, nope, you're the government. And as a journalist, I was offended, but I really couldn't do much about it. So we were granted into the government system to get permission. The paperwork to do this is substantial. It took us a year to complete. But about a month before we completed it, the FAA changed its mind. It said, on further review, education is not a government function. So they have to go the commercial route. Now they had created a commercial route by then that they could do. But education instantly, by one lawyer's opinion, said education no longer a government function. We applied anyway. They rejected it. Said, you're not a government entity. And we were angry about this, as you might imagine. Part of the reason why we were angry about this is because to fly as a commercial entity in the United States, you have to be a licensed manned aircraft pilot. There is no drone license to get. So you have to learn how to fly an airplane with your butt in the controller. And that's terrifying because I'm not a pilot. I never intended to be a pilot. In many countries, to fly commercially, you have to have some form of license. Correct me if I'm wrong, Giovanni, but it's above 2 kilos. In Italy, you have to have above 300 grams. Oh, excuse me, I thought it was up to 2. So if you fly something above 300 grams, basically you fly something bigger than this, and you have to have a license. Now, is there a drone-specific license? Yeah. Yes, okay. You're very fortunate in Italy that there is one, because in the US, there is no such license. You have to learn how to fly a manned aircraft. So guess what I did last summer? This is actually after I had done my first solo flight. When you fly solo for the first time, really all you do is you take off, you do a lap around the airport, you come in and land, you take off again, you do a lap around the airport, you do that 3 times. Your family comes out and watches you. Your flight instructor watches you. That's my flight instructor in the back there. And then if you don't die, they cut the back of your shirt off like a bird getting its wings, and that's what they say. They cut your tail, and now you can fly on your own, little bird. So that shirt that I'm wearing no longer has a back, and my flight instructor is writing on it on the hood of the airplane that I learned how to fly. I only nearly died twice, both times my own fault, but I actually carry it with me wherever I go. I am now a licensed manned aircraft pilot, and every time you hear a small aircraft above you, you should be terrified that they give people like me one of these. We applied for our permit to fly as a commercial entity in October, and we are still waiting on it. We expect it any day now, but I've been saying that for 2 months. Things in aviation go very, very slow. Around the world, as I said, civil aviation authorities are changing these things all the time. We are waiting on the FAA's regulations now. Some countries, I hope, stay the way they are. I really do. Brazil just out and out said, we are not going to have regulations because we want a massive UAS industry in Brazil, so we're not going to have rules. You just do whatever the heck you want. As long as you're being safe, we're fine. Much of Latin America is pretty permissive. I actually think Chile has the world's most exquisitely drawn rules because you have to take a short test. Their aviation rules with regards to drones is a 9-page document. So you have to take a 20-question test about a 9-page document. If you've been to college, you should be able to knock that out no problem. The only problem for me getting a Chilean drone license is one of the requirements is you must be able to read and write Spanish. They do not specify how well, but I'm going to guess better than I can. And you also have to be 17, which crossed that line a long time ago. The rules in a lot of places are very simple. Some places have outright banned them. Countries that have no capacity to deal with this, who have maybe more repressive regimes, have just outright banned these. Most countries are somewhere in the middle. And that means the rules are, you can get through them, but they are going to be very difficult and very complicated, and it's going to be very easy to violate them. The penalties generally are very stiff on paper. They look very expensive. They may involve jail time. But few people have ever been charged, fined, or jailed under these in any country. So if you want to become a drone pilot, you are committing yourself to 2 things. You are going to have to follow civil aviation policy and law in your country very, very close. You are also going to have to follow debates about privacy very, very close. Now, the second one, that's not so hard. We're journalists. We do that all the time. We're sort of interested in this. It applies to what we do. But a lot of countries are moving in parallel tracks. Their aviation regulations, their safety regulations are moving, and their privacy regulations are moving at the very same time. The FAA's rules allegedly are coming in June, the major rewrite that's coming. I say allegedly because the FAA would be the worst journalists on the face of the planet. They have never met a deadline, ever, ever. Some of them are years past and they just more or less ignored them. Raise your hand if you work in a newsroom where you can ignore deadlines. Don't see any hands. Yes. So the FAA says they're going to have their major rewrite done in June. Whether or not they actually have it done is another matter. But what will that look like? What will more or less become the first shot at a global standard? It will be day flight only. It will be line of sight only. Most countries in the world only allow line of sight operations, meaning you have to be able to see it with your eyes. I just turned 41 last week. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be. So line of sight's getting a little shorter every year. You may not fly over people unless you are flying one of these. It has to be exceedingly small to the point where the chance of somebody getting hurt is less than 1%. I could power this up fully and have you come up here and stick your fingers in the blades and you'd say, ow, and that's it. I actually make my students stick their fingers in this so they learn not to do that. But I know it's not going to hurt them. So what they are unclear about is you may not fly over, but can you fly near? Does every person have a bubble around them that the law says you can't fly into? And that's unclear as of yet. They have not published these final rules yet, so we don't know. It's probably safe to say that our ethical standards are going to insist on a bubble around people, that you don't get nearer to people. You cannot have ethical journalism if you are putting people's lives at risk by your own hand. So over people is bad. You will not have to have a pilot's license, but you will have to take a certification test. Likely going to be 40 questions, likely going to be multiple choice. They will generally be about airspace restrictions, where you can and cannot fly. They will be about where you can find out aviation weather from, which is sort of funny because most of that aviation weather doesn't deal with below 500 feet above the ground. You will be able to fly in controlled airspace. In most countries, controlled airspace is anywhere from 2 to 6 kilometers, 5 miles, somewhere in that neighborhood, around an airport. It really depends on the airport, depends on how busy it is. It depends on their approach procedures, where airplanes are going to get routed to come in and out of landing zones. You'll be able to fly in those controlled airspaces with permission, and they're going to establish a protocol of how to do that. Under those rules, drone journalism becomes vastly more common, pretty much everywhere. Every day I hear a little bit more about somebody doing something somewhere, and it's fascinating. I was going to show these earlier, but I got rolling. This is a project that a former student of mine did in Tanzania, where they went out with CCTV to the Minara Ranch and talked about this partnership, this private partnership, where these rangers were hired with international money to protect the preserve and protect the animals that were on there. And it is 18,000 hectares. It's huge. So giving people some idea of how big it is a very early goal in any story like this. And my student, Ben, was able to combine footage from the ground with footage from the air, which you'll get here in a moment. It's just your kind of standard broadcast news story. Let me skip ahead just a hair. Where you get to see herds of elephants. I think a wildebeest migration happened in the middle of it. In a previous one, he had herds of zebra. He actually said one of the most difficult things to fly around are giraffes, because A, they're up in the same airspace you are, and they're very, very curious, and they're not afraid of it. So he's more or less flying through the lens of the camera, and the giraffes would walk up to it. And he has very little depth perception. So he had to back away and get away. There it is. So that drone is sitting in my office. It has more airline miles than I do right now. And it's been to India, Turkey, Tanzania, Kenya, Dubai, Chile, and we'll go a few more places later this year. This is a story that actually never did quite happen about a dump in Nairobi. And this shot right here is the purpose-built context shot that I was talking about. That man lives in this dump. It's an illegal dump, but he lives there and he picks through the trash every day to find things of value that he can sell, and that's how he lives. All this is doing is going straight up into the air. But you have a notion of the scale of the Dandara dump and the scale of the environmental problem that it creates. That dump's not supposed to be there. But it just kind of showed up one day and the government didn't do anything about it, and then decades later it's grown into a massive dump and the city has grown around it. And they're trying to remove it, but as you can see, it's substantial and it's going to take time. The beautiful Nairobi River, very clean. You can see the trash below straight out of the dump into the river. One of the most heartbreaking things for me is here in right there. See the children swimming in the river? Next to this dump on the other side of the river is their school. On the other side of the dump is another school. And they have days when the wind blows when they cannot go outside because the trash blows up and they could be injured by it actually flying around. It's caustic to their lungs. They have a hard time breathing. They can't go out and play football because they just can't breathe. But that's what I was talking about with a purpose-built context machine. Those images would take paragraph upon paragraph of writing to accomplish. And in just a few seconds of video, you have a much greater picture in your mind. I'm actually going to show you a video that I have never shown anywhere, and you'll see why in a moment. This past summer, I gave a tour to a community group. This is our indoor football practice facility. Actually, this is our old indoor football practice facility. We have two of them. The one the team actually uses, I can't go inside. But the old one that the team gave to the university, I can go in there and fly around. It's a very large building. And I was giving a demonstration. And just flying around the field, showing them what it looked like, showing them what it sounded like, when I decided to show off a little bit and fly down the length of the field. Now, one thing you have to understand about an indoor facility like this is the walls are mostly made of metal. Metal tends to interfere with signals, and right about here, I no longer have control of the drone. And there's the wall. It actually sat on a ledge about 10 feet up above the ground, not coming down, just sitting here like this. And I had to scale the wall to get my drone back in front of the community group that thought I was an expert in drones. So this is what I mean that things can go wrong. Drones occasionally will fly away. They'll take the last command they got and just keep going. If the last command you gave it was to go straight up, they can go as high as 3,000 feet in the air. They can be very clearly in the same airspace as aircraft. And that's a very, very bad thing. We do not want that. So those are the kinds of things that become more possible in the very near future under these rules. Our coverage of disasters is going to improve dramatically. I worked in Florida as a newspaper reporter for 10 years. I covered 6 hurricanes. It is very, very difficult to describe destruction that extends over 100 miles from the ground. It's very difficult in the first few days to know if you're near the center of destruction. Okay. I believe we're going to get over photo and video from drones very, very quickly. It's going to become cliched. We're going to use it in every boring story that ever comes along. Every house fire, every car crash, every time there's a traffic jam, every time there's a community festival, we'll have a shot. There'll be a drone 30, 40 meters in the air. Here's a picture of it. It'll just become part of the noise. Where I think the real future of drones is in data journalism, where we use them to map things. We'll be able to do investigative journalism in the environment where we'll map things over and over and over again and show change over time. That's very hard to see without getting in the air. It means also going to get into challenging stories. We're going to have to ask ethical questions that we haven't had to ask before. I'm going to run out of time, but I would tell you a story about I'll tell you a very, very brief story. When I was a reporter just starting out, I covered a murder in Little Rock, Arkansas, where a man got high on drugs and beat his children to death with a rock. And he laid them out in the yard in the shape of a cross because he thought he was Jesus. And he went running off without his clothes on. The police arrested him, and I got to the house actually before the first responding officer got there. So I saw those boys in the yard, and I saw the shape that they were laid out in, very meticulously laid out in. And that actually became part of the story, how he carefully laid them on the ground in the shape of a cross very specifically. I thought about that case about a year ago for some reason, and I thought, well, if I had a drone back then, would I have used it in that case? And my initial answer was no, because the first thing I saw when I got to that crime scene was those boys, and I honestly can still see those boys in my mind. That was a very scarring experience for me. The second thing I heard was the mother of those boys who was in the front yard. She was on her knees crying in such a way that I will never forget. In fact, I'm getting chills now because I can hear her crying. It is the only thing I can describe to you is it was the sound of pain. And I thought, if I had a drone, would I use it? And I said, no. But then I thought, well, hold on. If I were a block away, if I were the next group of houses over, and I just got just above the treetops, and I got a photo of the crime scene, and got when the boys were covered by the police, and you could see that, and you could get sort of an establishing shot of the scene, would I have done that? Yeah, I think I probably would have done that, because I could do it in such a way that it wouldn't disturb the scene. But then I thought, if I have one, that means everybody has one. That means the 3 local television stations have them. That means the radio stations have them. That means the websites, the bloggers, the freelancers. Everybody's got one. And so instead of 1, we may have 15 or 20. And journalists are competitive. It doesn't take a great leap of imagination to think someone's going to just scooch up a little bit to try to get a little bit closer and get a little bit better of a shot. And then somebody's going to follow in behind them. And then you're just going to have tit for tat until everybody's flying right over that mother. And all she can hear is the noise of propellers. And we have deprived her of her right to mourn and to grieve. There's nobody in here right now who's going to tell me, that's a great idea. We should do that, because it's inhuman. It's not hard to see the ethical problem there. But that noise, that very distinct noise, has a psychological effect on people. And we have to be conscious of it. We have to be conscious of how it would affect people who are displaced. A very large broadcaster asked me if they could take one to Syrian refugee camps and fly over them. And I said, well, the shot would be great because it would give people an idea of how many people are being housed in those camps. But you're talking about a group of people that were displaced by war, who might view a strange flying thing over them as a threat. And you might cause a panic, and people may die. And they said, oh, never mind. And they didn't do it. So we have to think about that noise. We have to think about privacy. We have to think about how we're going to impact people. Can we do these things in a way that respects the subjects of our stories and still gives people the perspective they need to understand something? So in other words, for drone journalism to become a useful tool, we have to rewrite our aviation laws. We have to solve a centuries-old debate about property. We have to rethink our concept of privacy. We have to extend our professional ethics code to flying robots. No problem. What, next week? Y'all good? Let's do that. With the few minutes that we have left, are there any questions? Yeah. I think there's a microphone somewhere that might be, or am I holding the microphone? No, there is one.
Thank you for your talk. I think, yeah, definitely probably more drones will be around, but my question is, as as we're taking a new step of journalism, in this case, through a new tool, a new way of capturing the shot, do you think that the kind of Western-centric journalistic ethics that have kind of been passed down through the decades and centuries still holds true, or should we be looking at drones for local journalists off the grid in Asia, Africa, Latin America? Should we be thinking about almost decolonizing the ethics and ideas that we see as being the core of journalism, and being able to let other people kind of find their own way into how drones can capture stories? Or are the things that you're proposing now, do you think they have a global impact and they should be the baseline for every journalist in the world, or is it culturally dependent and subjective?
Wow. Congratulations. I have never gotten that question before. And I've done 100 of these talks. That's awesome. I would say that respect for the subject is global. I would also say that we already do at least somewhat mold our ethical practices around local custom, because everywhere has a different conception of community, of privacy, of property, and how sensitive they are to that. I actually love coming to different countries to talk about drones, because in the United States, everybody believes they have an ironclad, God-given, constitutionally established right to privacy. They don't. It doesn't exist in the Constitution. It is a creation of law, and it is a creation of fragmented law. So if you ask 10 Americans what their right to privacy is, you'll get about 19 answers, and about 18 of them will conflict with each other. Other countries in the world have much stricter, well-defined, well-drawn-out, and more universally agreed-upon levels of privacy. So our journalism sort of conforms to that anyway, and I don't think that drones are that special in that regard. Much of the ethical questions that you can deal with drones is, would you do it on the ground? If you had a long telephoto lens, and would you do it from the ground? And if the answer is no, there's nothing about a flying robot that says, now it's suddenly fine. I would be really interested to know if there are places that have truly different conceptions of sort of photojournalism ethics when it comes to capturing images of subjects of news events that are fundamentally different. Most of the time when I talk to my students, it's just, first the question you should ask is, because you can, should you? And the second one is, would you do it from the ground? And if the answer to either one of them is no, then put it in the box and go home, or cover the story some other way. But I think our own local customs and laws around privacy and our own sort of notions of community are going to guide us in this regard a lot more than sort of journalistic ethics will. Other questions? Yeah. This should be good, because Giovanni's a lawyer who specializes in drone practice here in Italy, so I'm in trouble.
Anyway, no, thank you very much, Matt, for your talk. It was really inspiring. Just wanted to know your opinion. Do you think that the current wave of anti-terroristic measure would have an impact on drone legislation?
I do, and in fact, somewhat indirectly, they impacted my decision of whether or not to bring a drone here with me, because airlines and airport security officials are becoming much more concerned about LiPo batteries, and these batteries are substantial. I get randomly screened at pretty much every airport I fly through. I keep a collection of all the notices of my bags being inspected. They are on the wall in my office and are now beginning to cover that wall. There is already a heightened level of security around these devices and a level of skepticism among security agencies. I think it will get exponentially worse when a terrorist uses one for some materially substantive act in a terrorist incident. I don't necessarily mean arming one or putting a bomb on one, because actually as a bomb delivery device, they're terrible. They can't carry enough explosives to really do any real damage. The secondary point of that, though, is this is not new. There was a TV show in the 1960s called The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And in 1965, there is an episode where somebody puts a bomb on a remote-controlled airplane and flies it into the U.N.C.L.E. headquarters and causes massive amounts of damage. That clip's on YouTube. If you look for Man from U.N.C.L.E. drone on YouTube, you'll find it. So we've had this sort of threat of remotely controlled things bringing destruction about for 50 years. So it's not new. If, as a society, we're going to worry about everything being armed and everything becoming a weapon, then we have to worry about everything becoming a weapon. A bicycle's a weapon. A banana's a weapon. Anything that you could put explosives on becomes a weapon. That's not going to fare well in a free society. You're not going to be able to walk down the street then. Your shoes are a weapon. This jacket is a weapon. So there's a temptation to believe that these are a new threat. And there are a lot of opportunistic security agencies that are viewing them as a new threat. They've been around for a long time, and the notion of putting a bomb on one has been around for even longer. It's possible now, but nobody's done it because it's truly a terrible means of delivering a weapon. Other questions? Yep.
Hello.
We're going to have to get out of here. But
Did you concern with any aspect of the military drone? If yes, do you believe that some disaster made in, in Iraq or Afghanistan, were depending on the drone guided by a pilot, real pilot, or rather virtual pilot?
Well, I always want to separate military aircraft from these devices. These devices have much more in common with your cell phone than they do with a military aircraft. Really what these drones are now are a flying cell phone. It's a GPS, it's a computer, it's an accelerometer and a gyroscope, and the computer can control it. Most civil aviation authorities are deeply distrustful of autopilot systems on the drones. They do not want the drones flying themselves. You can program them and let them fly themselves, but you have to be, as the pilot in command, standing there with the controller in your hand, ready to take over if anything goes wrong. You can't set it and forget it. You can't program it and then walk away. You have to have your eyes on it. It can't fly beyond your line of sight. You have to have the controller in your hand at all times. So that's pretty much a global standard. I don't know of any country that allows autonomous beyond line of sight flight outside of like very specific research applications that involve a ton of work. I do worry about military drones, but on a wholly separate level, on a much more political and humanitarian level than a technological and journalistic level. But honestly, if you want to track development of drones, follow the development of cell phones. The more that battery power is increased, the more that processing power is increased, and power draw is decreased on these, that technology is immediately transferred over to a drone.
So let's say I wanted to buy one of these and use one.
Amazon.com.
Cool. But like my actual question is, so these days for cell phones, there's sort of like a minimum idea of what a cell phone picture should look like, of what kind of audio there should be on the cell phone, what would you say is like the minimum acceptable quality for one of these drones if you're a professional journalist?
Most of them have camera. You want a really good camera gimbal on the bottom because that will gyroscopically stabilize the camera. The camera will stay dead still even if the drone's flopping around. That will keep your audience from getting sick, which is a good thing. You'll probably spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 for a good drone or a good gimbal or up. Those gimbals almost all are purpose-built for GoPros. So your GoPro 3, GoPro 4, that neighborhood, that will get you plenty good enough for most applications. Now, GoPro lenses are really wide, so your altitudes end up getting constrained because really above 100 meters or so, you sort of lose detail and you're just sort of looking at the countryside at that point. There are two companies, well, three now, that make decent drones. Yep. There's a company called DJI. They're a Chinese manufacturer. They're the largest manufacturer in the world. The ones that we use are all a Phantom series. They're up to the Phantom 4. Ours is a Phantom 2. We bought it a while ago. We have an Inspire 1. The Inspire 1s are about $3,000. They have a 4K camera at 30 frames a second, a purpose-built camera for that drone. It's not a GoPro. The image quality off of it is breathtaking. There's a company, a United States company called 3D Robotics. They build a device called a Solo that has a GoPro on it, and then there's a separate company called Unique. YUNEEC is how you pronounce that. They've got a drone that are becoming more popular. And I'm being told that I've got to get off the stage and shut up. So if you want to talk to me, I'll be right here. Thank you very much for coming.